Good morning, everybody, and welcome to you all. Bore da bawb, croeso mawr I chi, braf iawn cael eich cwmni chi eto bore yma. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is John Parry-Jones, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's breakfast briefing. We have what John just described as a select crew of people here in the suite with us this morning, and we have a number of people online. So welcome to you all. A great pleasure to welcome you here to discuss how to avoid investigating your employees, something that's so important or has the potential to be so important to so many of us during the course of our working lives. So many lessons that we are likely to learn this morning. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Andrew Cooper and Adrian Neal from Aneurin Bevan Health Board. And they've been working with Cardiff University to provide or to produce these workshops. And I'm also very pleased and very grateful that Professor Sarah Gilmore is here with us this morning. Sarah is the university face of this programme, and I'm delighted that you guys are able to share your learnings with us this morning. Now, before I hand over to Sarah, can I just remind you, those of you who are at home, that speech-to-text captioning is available this morning. So if you click on the link that I hope Angharad has probably put in the chat for you, if you open up the link, I also sent in the email that I sent this morning. There's an instruction on how to use that link. You probably just need to open the two windows and run them side by side. Hopefully you'll work your way around that, but if you're not sure and it doesn't work, then please do get in touch with us on the chat. Now, we have a few events coming up. We have lots of events coming up, actually. It's a really busy period for us. So you can see Wednesday, the 12th of July is going to be a busy period. Professor Yingling Wang is running the Circular Economy Workshop. Looking specifically, it says that it's a construction workshop, but it's a whole lot more than that. We do have a registration page that we will put the link in the chat for you shortly. That registration page, it's worth, if you are a supply chain practitioner, it's worth having a look at the agenda for that morning, because there is a huge amount that's going to be discussed. They're looking at the opportunities for digital passports, digital means of tracking a product or a material throughout its useful life, shall we say. It's such an interesting agenda. Go into it, have a look, and see how it may be of use to you in your organization. Now, I enjoy every one of the briefings that we run here. Everyone I enjoy. I look forward to planning them and to taking part in them and the follow-up and so forth. But occasionally, just from time to time, there are briefings that sort of appeal to my sense of interest. Happened to me before Christmas when Noel Mooney was here. I had a particular interest in that. So for me to see that we're going to have a whole session devoted to talking about Greggs is a real appeal. So I'm looking forward to that immensely. Those of you who've been with us, who've been part of our briefings for the last few years will know that the July briefing session we turned into a bit of a conversation with. We spoke with Sarah John last year, I think it was, Julianne Haynes from the Principality, and James Timpson 3 years ago. It's 3 years since we spoke with James Timpson. So an informal conversation to understand the business and so forth. We're delighted that Richard Hutton, CFO of Greggs, has agreed to spend an hour with us discussing the business, how Greggs managed to continue to progress in what is such a difficult market for everybody at the moment. I seem to blink and they've opened a new store somewhere. So there is a secret there that they have, and it's going to be really interesting to find out from him how that works and how they do it. I should point out that briefing is going to be an online only briefing. We won't have anything in here. Richard can't join us here in Cardiff, so it will be online only. I'll refer to Help to Grow in a moment on my next slide. But also just a reminder that September breakfast briefing is a bit of a follow-up to Yingling's in terms of looking at the circular economy. We have Nicholas Jordan, who is head of a circular economy at KPMG, joining us to take it to the next step. So it'll be a follow-up from the discussion that is taking place next month. But again, a date to keep in your diary. The autumn is looking really busy. If you do have any ideas, any thoughts of things that you would like to discuss with us, that you'd like us to present to you as a breakfast briefing, please do speak with one of the team here, grab hold of me or speak with somebody so that we can have that next conversation. We'd be delighted to do that. The autumn series, we already have penciled in a session on artificial intelligence, living wage, and a briefing that's linked up to the productivity week. So there's a lot lined up. We're just sort of working on the dates to bring those to you. Help to Grow, just in case you are interested, if you're an SME The Help to Grow program, if you don't know about it, is a program designed for SMEs to try and help them kickstart their business. It's a 12-week program, which is a mix of face-to-face learning here with us in the school and online sessions. I think the key benefit, everybody has positive feedback about this course. Key benefit is working with your peers and working with mentors. You're assigned a mentor to work with, a business mentor to work with, and the benefits are significant to everybody who has taken, who's been a part of those courses. Feedback is always excellent. So do give Linda a call or come through me if you want. If you want me to connect you with Linda, then just drop me a line. Finally, some of the final bits and pieces. Just a reminder that this morning's session is being recorded. Please bear that in mind. Parking. I know most of you have told me that you've scribbled down your parking details this morning. For those of you here who are here this morning, just double check with us before you leave that you have given us your details or that we've received them. We just want to double check that. And finally, in terms of the Q&A session at the end, after the presentations, we'll lead into a Q&A session which Sarah will host for us. If you're here in the suite, please, if you just raise your hand and wait until we bring you a microphone so that we can make sure that the people at home are able to hear the question. If you're online, Angharad will encourage you to pop your question into the chat function, and we'll probably then ask you to unmute yourself so that you can ask the question yourself. So if you just follow those guides, then we can make sure that the Q&As are handled in a structured way. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Sarah. Let's leave it on there for you, Sarah, while you do your formal introductions for us.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for coming in today for this business breakfast, and hello to all of you who are watching online. I'm Professor Sarah Gilmore. I'm Professor of Organisation Studies here at Cardiff Business School. I've got a lengthy background and interest in the sort of the domain of HRM. Over the past 20 odd years, I've written books, book chapters, papers on various different aspects of HR activity. And the issues that we are going to discuss today, I think, are some of the most important and some of the most difficult for HR and for organisations. I'm sure that we've all got our own personal story. It might be of an event that happened to us, to somebody we know, a member of our family who has dealt with or witnessed a case going through the discipline and grievance procedure that was handled badly. From my own perspective, an organisation that I worked for some time ago was taken to an employment tribunal. It's all out there in the public domain, so I'm not telling tales out of school. The organisation lost, and the outcomes financially are going to be substantial. The payoffs to the protagonists involved are going to be somewhere in the region of, the low six figures, and that's aside from the legal costs. So obviously there is that financial element coming into play here. But what is often not considered are the other costs to the organisation. I know from speaking to former colleagues that it has really polarised them. There is a lot of anger, and most of that anger, it has really come about because it all could have been avoided. And I think if any of you are HR practitioners or line managers, you will know how good it is to be able to deal with difficult issues such as discipline and grievance or potential discipline and grievance cases at the lowest level. I think one of the things that I also want to raise here is that many of you will also be aware of the ACAS Code of Conduct. We are not saying that cases should never go through the ACAS Code or go through the discipline and grievance case. That's not what we're saying, because sometimes they absolutely do. But what we're going to look at is, in a sense, an alternative way of managing some of these disputes, if that is at all possible. And we're going to be doing that in the best of company. I have been working with Andrew and Adrian for a while now, and I was very inspired by going to one of their training events some time ago now. And I'm hoping that they're going to give some information about ones that are coming up. So as a plug, if you can get to them, they are absolutely phenomenal. I absolutely flew home in my car from Newport to Bristol. It was that good. It's one of the best things that I'd attended in ages. So Andrew, who is going to start first, heads up the avoidable employee harm function at Aneurin Bevan, and he will be followed by his colleague, Dr. Adrian Neal, who heads up the employee wellbeing function. A little bit about the success of the work that they've been doing. So don't just take it from me. Their work on employee investigations won the innovation category in the NHS Wales HR Awards. And they were also shortlisted for an award in the CIPD Awards this year. So, you don't get that for nothing. So, that's absolutely tremendous. And the work that they do includes a program of research. And last month, they published their first paper on the impact of poorly applied HR policies on individuals and organizations. So their work is now starting to hit the academic domain as well as the practitioner. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew to take us or start us off on this journey.
Eva, thank you. Thank you for that really warm welcome. And it's really good to be here with you this morning. And we'd like just to spend just a little time about the work that we've been doing within Aneurin Bevan. One of the reasons that Sarah invited us, one of the reasons we were really pleased to be here speaking to you in terms of colleagues in the room and to others online, is that we believe the approach that we're looking at could be applied far wider within the public sector, but also beyond. I also want to say as a caveat, we haven't arrived in terms of we haven't got this quite right yet, but we have invested time and resource into it because we've recognised just the significant harm that it does to individuals, to cultures, to organisations, and sometimes then impacting the delivery of services. So it's great to be able to have this opportunity to share this with you this morning, to perhaps sense check it with you. You might say, well, that couldn't possibly work with us, or perhaps that you might kind of say there's something to take away. So I've got some slides this morning. So the way that we've broken up this presentation, I'm going to do an overview around the improving our employee investigations work, but it actually fits in under a much bigger heading of that concept of avoidable employee harm. And Adrian's going to unpack that a bit later for us. But actually that language has really shaped how we take this work forward. So I thought I'd start just by letting you know a little about Aneurin Bevan University Health Board. So it's one of 7 integrated health boards within Wales. We look after the South East Wales area, so that's Blaenau Gwent, Caerphilly, Monmouthshire, Newport Tyne, South Powys, in terms of looking after a population of around 660,000 people. We employ between 15 and 16,000 staff, so, significant workforce. And then I've just put some of the figures there in terms of that breakdown. I want to start with some quite what we felt were compelling numbers. And actually the drive for this piece of work really came out of research from our HR team, who I have to say have been equally passionate about this piece of work as we have in the employee wellbeing team. And there were 3 kinds of bits of information that really caused us concern and that we wanted to take forward in terms of this piece of work. So the first one, we looked at the investigations that we'd run over a 15-month period. And over that 15-month period, we'd worked out that we'd run 109 employee investigations within our workforce and within the health board. And yet when we looked, over 50% of those had received no sanction. So we had started a process with individuals that we have increasingly acknowledged as being incredibly harmful psychologically to individuals, and then recognized that over 50% of those have led to no sanction. The second number that I wanted to highlight for you was we worked out the average length of an investigation. It came out at 156 days. 156 days,
About 6 months. Now, Adrian and colleagues explained to me over and over that often when somebody starts an investigation process, their anxiety can go to the highest level possible and stay at that position until the investigation. So actually, to be putting our staff through these processes without kind of checking their sense of impact and actually, are there other ways of doing it, was something we felt as a moral imperative that we had to address. We also kind of map out in this presentation, it makes good business sense as well. And then the other third element was within the employee wellbeing team that I work in and which Adrian leads within the health board, we saw an increased number of referrals from colleagues within the organisation going through these processes and being traumatised by them. So fairly big numbers, but actually for each number is a person, for each number is somebody's career, sometimes the impact on their life in terms of their family, and sometimes their sense of future. And what we've identified over this year are 4 clear areas that we've really just kind of been borne out constantly as we take this work forward around the impacts. The first one is non-unsurprisingly that first impact to the individual. Adrian may touch on this kind of when he speaks, but just that psychological harm to individuals in terms of what happens when somebody is essentially kind of taken out of the organisation, the disciplinary process is started, the sense of detachment and isolation, has a major bearing on their psychological harm. We've also been looking as well at the impact of the longer term impact. So we worked with an individual and a case study where they had a suspected diagnosis of PTSD 14 months after the investigation had concluded. So we're not just talking about individuals going through the process, we're talking very much about that longer term impact. And as you'll see with that, reputational harm and fears. We started with the individual, but we've met people involved in delivering the process. I've had HR colleagues come up to me and tell me, Andrew, it's the worst part of the job to be caught in terms of delivering a process, in terms of all the challenges of managing it. Investigation officers that are sometimes line managers are often caught between delivering the process and providing a duty of care to the individual and kind of almost feel that they can't do both successfully and one will trump the other. Often the process trumps looking and providing the duty of care because the process is what our staff are being measured on. But then what we've also seen is that as colleagues look on, seeing a process being delivered, potentially not being delivered well, it starts to chip away at the psychological safety within the organisation. That whole concept of where people can feel safe, can feel that part of the organisation, can feel that they can make mistakes without necessarily major punishment. And certainly within healthcare, we need psychological safety probably more than any other sector. And you add all that up and it starts to chip away at trust and confidence in the leadership of the organisation as well. So another major harm. The third area that we started looking and certainly has been borne out this year is around the financial and economic costs to the organisation. So we started by looking at what is the average cost of an investigation for our health board. I have to say, when we kind of put the figures together, it ran into tens of thousands of pounds, well over £20,000 in terms of running an investigation process. A significant financial outlay in terms of people's time, resources, backfilling costs for staff. We've been working with a health economist who turned to us and said, that's small fry compared to the larger costs. And he went on to talk about how this chips away at retention. How do we keep staff within the system when they see the impact of these processes? How do we become an employer of choice for those looking to want to come into the organisation and to work for us? And then the larger area that he talked about was missed opportunity costs from an economic level. So we as a health board, we are focused on improving the health and well-being for our population. If we are over-focused in delivering excessive investigations, which involves senior staff, we're missing some of those major opportunities. So again, really emerged over this last year, that economic impact. And then the fourth area that we are just kind of starting to look at is how this impacts the delivery of care to our patients and communities. So when we did that exercise to estimate the cost of an investigation, we had a look at the levels of staff that we put through our processes. And mainly they are what we would call bands 2s, 3s and 4s, which are frontline healthcare support staff and nursing staff. So that if an individual needs to be suspended or they take sick leave because of the stress and anxiety, we've got to bring in bank staff, and that we're looking at how does this impact the continuity and consistency of care provided. So what does that look like in terms of potential harm? Now we're just starting to look at that, but just kind of joining the dots to take us to this point. And then our final piece is around failure to learn. And we see this within our organisation, kind of organisations we work. Often the investigation process is so challenging, demanding and traumatic for everyone involved that once it's concluded, everybody wants to move on quickly because nobody wants to revisit. Experts are telling us that's the worst thing, because at that point, that's the point you stop and learn to make sure that you carry the lessons forward from that. But what we find is everybody is so quick to move on that we end up repeating those same mistakes the next time we go around it. So that's a bit of the picture and the journey that we've been on over the last year. And certainly from when we started last July, we didn't even have this narrative as clear in terms of our thinking, but just that time and investment. So again, not for a question now, but perhaps if I may ask you a question to feed back in the chat. We are looking at this from a health perspective, but we sense, in terms of the wider public sector, within the commercial sector, there are things that can be learned from this. And that kind of leads me on to that next slide. It's not just happening in healthcare. We are seeing the impact of either investigation processes going wrong or other HR processes not being delivered well and having significant impact for individuals. I just want to quickly tell you what some of the things that we've done within Aneurin and Bevan around this work in terms of how we sought to make the change. I have to say this first one, incredibly powerful for us as a team and as an organisation, that our executive team made it quite clear we would only take forward employee investigations as the last resort. Often investigations were being used for all the wrong reasons. Sometimes colleagues would say it's easier to run a disciplinary process than a capability process. I'll leave that for a moment. There might be other reasons in terms of I lost my light, but that might be kind of one of the reasons, but there were a whole host of others that we actually wanted to say as an organisation, let's make this the last resort. We've really wanted to use data and story. So we've shared some of the numbers with you in terms of we wanted our data to drive change. Sometimes it's not until you know the data, you understand the size of the problem. And it was actually pulling those numbers out at the beginning that actually gave us a sense. And story. So how do we kind of tell individuals' story and the impact that this is having? Adrian's going to talk a little about this around the avoidable employee harm. How do we change the language so that we're no longer just delivering a process, but we're actually delivering a process that seeks to avoid as much harm to our employees as possible? And when I kind of flag that comment, that's not just about the person going through it, it's the wider team. How do we reduce harm to our HR colleagues, to our line managers, to staff side representatives who tell us what a challenging process this is? And then within NHS Wales, we've got a major focus on something called compassionate leadership. There's lots out there to read. I won't go into it too much at the moment, but actually what colleagues say to me, Andrew, does that mean we're going to go soft on people? And I actually say, no, actually, the key elements of compassionate leadership is about listening, attending, and empathizing in order to make the best decision. Now, that might very well be a hard decision and in terms of having impact on individuals, but the way the decision has been arrived at is much more compassionate and rounded and hopefully lead into a far better outcome for all those involved. And then just on the right-hand side of the screen, we did a number of HR pieces of work with our teams in terms of we developed our initial assessment, which is a pre-investigation document that encourages managers to collect as much relevant information as possible to inform the decision that they are going to make, so that actually investigations aren't started on a whim or a little bit of information, but they're actually started on a research piece of an exercise of research to kind of inform our decision. We've also looked at how do we help staff consider mitigations. So it's really interesting in terms of the training that Sarah referred to. As part of the training, we share a case study of a nurse that's made an error within the organisation. We share it with colleagues and we say to them, what are you going to do? What decision are you going to take? And it's always interesting the way the room splits into two. I've called them the law group and the grace group. So the law group looks at the case study and says, clear error, clear mistake, straight down an investigation, disciplinary goods. The grace group spends a bit more time, looks at it and starts asking questions like, yeah, but what was going on? What were the circumstances around this mistake? Who is the person that we're talking about? And they start asking questions around how long has the person worked within the organisation? What's their record like? What was going on perhaps on the ward at the time? And in terms of asking those questions, they come up with a very different scenario and a very different recommendation as the way to proceed. Those are the conversations that we want happening within our organisations, because we recognise, as you probably do within yours, actually very few people come into work to do a bad job, that actually in terms of the errors and mistakes that are made, we seldom consider the impact of the system on those decisions. And if we are wanting to create learning cultures rather than punitive ones, we need that grace group to be exploring them. And we also kind of, with our HR colleagues and line manager staff, looked at alternative options. It kind of always felt that the disciplinary route was always the one that shot to the top of the list. Actually, we unpack the list. We do fast track. We do opportunities for informal conversations. Perhaps there's an opportunity to develop capability in a new way. So looking at options. And then for me, one of the big things that we've done is actually catch people doing things right. You know, that actually Mandy at Leeds, one of the biggest divisions within our health board, she came along to the training and totally flipped her approach in terms of investigations and how she ran them. So the training looks at the harm that it does to staff. And then as a result of that, she went back, she reviewed and downgraded investigations. She took the initial assessments much more thoroughly, and as a result, didn't put as many through. So actually, you start to see the change in terms of what that looks like for the organisation. So for us, we wanted to be able to measure. How do you measure the impact of a programme and a piece of work? How do you see that we are moving things in the right direction and changing the dial? So this was data that we ran after we'd been running the programme for just 6 months. We've got our 12-month data coming up shortly. We were able to report a 66% reduction in investigations. So that's the number. What that meant was 28 people that would have gone through an investigation in 2021 in that period didn't in 2020, in 2022. So think about that. 28 people, 28 families, 28 careers, 28 teams that might not have been detrimentally affected by it. We'll work out the numbers in a moment, but in terms of that impact. And again, where we're trying to explore what that looks like to patients, but 28 potential teams that have been able to consistently deliver the care that they were providing. We've managed to reduce the length of an investigation from 156 to 120 days. Now, colleagues constantly remind me that we've got often complexity with outside bodies affecting that, but still we want to reduce that a little less because of that impact to individuals. And then we started looking at kind of some of the related figures. So we worked out that often people will go on sick leave as a result of an investigation. In fact, sometimes we're more surprised when they don't because of just the level of impact and harm. So actually, if you can start avoiding investigations, it impacts on the number of sick days that are taken. That impacts on patient care. That impacts on staff morale. That impacts on pressures being displaced in the wider system. And then we looked at savings. We've tried to build a model with this piece of work that touches, I guess, the different players within an organization. Some will focus rightly on the moral harm and the psychological harm to individuals. Some will look at the teams, and others will look at the finance. And there's nothing wrong in any of those, but actually to engage the most people, you need to tell our story. So in terms of savings. So just in terms of summary from me, we've just shared kind of some of the things that we've learned, and as we've started working with other organisations in NHS Wales, how we encourage them to take things forward. I need to say that the first one was the partnership between human resources and employee wellbeing. I have to say it's the first time that's happened in our organisation. We kind of feel a little embarrassed about it, but actually at the same time, why aren't we bringing employee wellbeing and HR much more closer together? The employee wellbeing understands our staff from that kind of emotional well-being connected sense, and HR delivering the policies and leading the management around it. But actually, when you bring the two together, you get an even increased rounded sense of how to take things forward. Again, that decision from our exec team to make these a last resort was critical. And whilst I've said we certainly haven't arrived, but we're in the process, how do we move this to change to business as usual? How do we make that major cultural change? And actually, this is more a culture change program than it is a HR process program. So that's the slide I think I'm leaving you with this morning. There's been two phases to this work. The first phase has been, how do we get the number of investigations down that we run in our organisation so that only the right employee investigations take place? Sarah touched on ACAS and the ACAS code. Absolutely, we are not saying we shouldn't be running employee investigations, but we are saying let's make sure that the ones we run are the right ones to be running. So that's phase one. Phase two, which is we're starting shortly, is how do we look after those better going through that process, that we have an immense duty of care to our staff going through an employee investigation process. How do we support them, their line managers, staff side representatives better? If I could just go back to that stat of somebody having a suggested diagnosis of PTSD 14 months after an investigation, how we bring somebody back into an organisation has major repercussions, not just for them, but the team and how they engage with colleagues going forward. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
So if we kind of take a step back conceptually, so Andrew detailed some of the operational work we've been doing over the last 8, 9, 10 months now, I lose track of time. That was very much wrapped around the focus on HR processes, particularly grievance processes. What I'm going to talk to you a little bit now is the bigger picture. Now, interestingly, when we first started to float the idea of the possibility that how we do business can cause harm, there was quite a few antibodies in our system and also at a NHS Wales level, understandably, because it was a new idea and there was an anxiety around, well, we can't possibly, our practices can't possibly create a problem for our staff. That's now dissipated, but initially we had, we renamed the focus on HR process exactly to be much more focused and kind of slightly less sensational. But this core idea, avoiding harm, prevention, still sits behind it. And I'm going to talk to you through a little bit about how we came to that and how we're kind of working through that. So early on, a colleague, Aled Jones, who was actually still has a post in Cardiff Uni, but is now at Plymouth Uni. He's quite a big name in avoidable patient harm and in speaking up. And we kind of got together and started thinking, well, this concept is quite a new concept when you look at staff. It's not a new one when you look at patient care. So winding back 30 years or so, those of you who do know the health service will know that there was a massive push, and there still is, to look at how can we prevent unavoidable harm in what might be considered day-to-day clinical practice. And so this diagram here really is just an illustration of that central concept, preventing harm in patient care, routine patient care, which at the time when this was raised was also unthinkable. How could clinicians possibly cause harm? We know that happens. We know that there is error in every industry, but in healthcare, error is high. So over the last 30 years, there has been a whole range of initiatives looking at things like medication errors, surgical procedures, and there's a massive improvement kind of program around healthcare at the moment. So, but it's taken 30 years to get to. So Aled was saying, oh, maybe we could just do the same thing, but looking at employee harm. Why reinvent the wheel? Use the same concept once the concept becomes acceptable. And what we're finding in this work since last July, it has now become acceptable, which is really interesting, much quicker than I expected. But we're kind of following the same pathway. And if we put that central idea, can you prevent untoward issues? Can you prevent and harm, not in a kind of obsessional focus on the individual, but on the whole system? You start to see the potential. So we've started, you could choose any of these kind of satellite circles for the HR processes, but you could also start looking at change processes. You could look at senior leadership in AB who said, what about recruitment and procurement? Ooh, interesting. Different nature, but actually these things we often take for granted, that we don't consider the wider impact on those who are exposed to it or those who have to implement processes. Now, we've chosen a pretty meaty one to begin with because the tangible evidence is there. But once you start thinking how we do business, it starts to open up the question, actually. Surely it's just good business to question how we do business, because we should always question, we should always learn. But a lot of us get very comfortable with doing things a certain way. We very rarely challenge our assumptions. So when you start asking questions around, well, what is the wider impact of this thing we're doing, even though it might be traditional and very comfortable, you start to think, oh, maybe there's room for improvement. So I see this is very much around performance, around good business, as it is about a moral duty to provide an environment for people to work. So another paper we're working on at the moment with Aled is trying to get a definition. So anything, it's only a thing if it has a definition. And at the moment, the avoidable harm concept is purely that, it's nebulous. So we have a paper under review at the moment where we're just trying to nail it down a little bit, but it really focuses on a very simple concept: is if you can recognize it as harmful and it's avoidable, then you are duty bound to change it, surely. So it's that central hook, but it could be a process, it could be a policy, it could be a cluster of behaviors, it could be a whole range of things that you just do which is previously considered to be normal. So with a little bit of luck, that will be out in the kind of academic domain fairly soon. But it makes sense. This isn't rocket science. We're trying to name a space that could be named in many different ways. We're just trying to give it a name. And it's got a lot of traction very, very quickly, which is interesting. So I guess if we're wanting to think about the wider motivation for doing this work, we want to reduce waste, and we want to reduce waste in a sense of financial, economic, but also the human aspect of that system. if we could talk about our people being our greatest resource, it's a tagline many systems use, but actually, what does that really mean? And we don't want to wrap people up in cotton wool, and we don't want to minimize or avoid the potential need to do formal processes, but actually how we do them and whether we do them is a really important decision, and it will affect what your business, how it can perform. We know we need cultures where there is greater psychological safety, there is reduced anxiety and fear, and there's a greater capacity for learning. That there are very few businesses that don't need that. I think, increasingly we're looking at a skilled workforce that are very mobile, as we know, and we need to keep them, we need to motivate them, but also each of those systems needs to be learning systems. Each of these systems needs to be independent to each other and needs to grow and minimize errors in the best way possible, which to me is in the context of high psychological safety, which is also high performance. And healthcare is absolutely, those factors are absolutely critical, but a lot of areas rely on those same conditions to thrive and grow. Be interesting to see what the CFO of Greg says about that. We need performance and we need high functioning teams. I've said that some of this will overlap, but actually you only get that if you create the cultures and the conditions for people to thrive. We need to bring people at NHS at the moment. We're at a real crisis point with keeping people, engaging them, but also bringing people in and not losing them quickly. So we've got a decade's worth of work to do in developing our workforce and working out what agile working means in this post-pandemic period, because a lot of people want something different. So if you can become the employee of choice, where the employee experience becomes a dominant driver, is there more of a chance of you keeping people? And that's becoming really important. We talked about employee experience. So I've stopped talking about well-being, or trying to avoid the word well-being, because it's too focused. But if we look at what people need to thrive in work, what their experience is, this is very much part of that experience. Organizations need to grow in terms of size, but also in reputation, in terms of brand. The NHS is absolutely no different. Our reputation is not great at the moment, but it starts from within. It starts from people believing and having pride in what they do. But I don't know any business that shouldn't invest in their reputation, both internal and external. I guess ultimately, the more resilient the system, or the resilience of the system, will depend on the people and their psychological contract with the organization, their capacity to deliver and their willingness to deliver. So to me, all of these things are ticking boxes that just make sense from a business point of view. Okay.
So just before questions, John's looking at me at the back in terms of moving this on. Just 2 slides. First of all, to say that we've developed a resources hub online that's bringing some of this thinking together, case studies, blogs, and those are some of the titles and the latest research. So we're going to be sharing that in the chat now. And then Sarah mentioned the training events that we run. So we're running the first training events on the 29th of June, specifically for the wider public sector. But also open to business. So again, this is running on 29th of June in Cardiff. I think that's week Thursday. But again, looking at delivering processes with compassion, some of the work in terms of how you reduced investigations, those financial savings, and why it's a really good reason to develop a last resort approach. What we've found is that colleagues that kind of bring a team mix in terms of a mix of HR, well-being, staff side, to really engage in the conversation is really quite powerful, because you take those conversations back to the organisation. So I know colleagues are going to drop a line in the chat around that. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I'll hand back to Sarah.
Thank you both very much. So we've got some time for questions. I think we have a mic, as ever. we can pass round. Right. Let's go online first, yes.
I think we've got a question online from Parul.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for taking the question. It's a really fascinating presentation. Completely on board with trying to set up our employees to be successful and how investigations can actually work against that. But often where an investigation is necessary, the misconduct that's being investigated isn't victim free. In fact, it can have, in the NHS case, it might be victims in the form of patients, but also, and in the wider corporate world, it's victims in the faces of managers who've not only had to manage the process, but have had to deal with whatever the conduct that was, behaviors that were going on for a period of time, as well as other peer groups. How do you envisage all the competing interests of the different interests being managed in order to deliver, justice, fairness, equity, and an outcome that considers all of those people's well-being and their performance as well?
Shall I start? And then, in terms of the presentation today, the focus has been very much on how do we make sure we don't put the wrong people through our investigation processes. I think that's been kind of one of the major drivers. We recognise that actually there absolutely are cases that need to go through very formal route in terms of addressing those. And to an extent, that's why all those other processes are in place in terms of the ACAS codes and kind of working with wider sector bodies to ensure that happens. So I think I'm not in a place to be able to respond how we might as an organisation do that, because we've got HR colleagues that actually do that, and they do that well. I think the distinction that we've been trying to make today is absolutely where there is a need for somebody to go through a formal process, we invest in that as well, that we actually create the time to do it well, so that actually where those investigation processes do need to happen, we put the right people on them. We make sure that they're not doing it kind of alongside a number of other parts of the job, that they're actually doing it very focused, so that they pull all the right groups and people together. So I think that's where in terms of responding to that question, that we actually take investigations and the processes much more seriously, that where they need to take place, we get the right people on them, that we create the space for them to do it, not as part of the job, but as a major job. And we urge all parties involved to do it as quickly as possible, acknowledging that there are lots of things that need to go through it.
Thank you. Great question. Don't really know the answer other than isn't it great to start to flag all the various stakeholders that get caught up in this process? And I think our research is absolutely evidencing that. I guess I don't want to add to Andrew's answer, but for me, what we often don't do is consider the why. So, I mean, as a psychologist, I quite like the question why. Why does something happen? Why do people do things? Why? Because that allows us learning. That gives us an understanding as a system to prevent it. So let's just say if there's a drug error, let's just say as a clinician, but also as a patient, I'll be wanting to know why that happened. Because if I know why, that can be prevented. There can be learning. The fact that there may well be a disciplinary process running parallel to that is a kind of secondary issue, and it may not even be necessary to understand the why. So I think once we understand what we're trying to achieve in each of these processes, then you pull out the tool that you need that is most helpful. And I guess also different tools will have different impacts on those around you. A bit like dropping a pebble in a pond. You chuck a brick in and you're going to get a big wave. You skim a stone and there'll be less of an impact, so there'll be less need to be aware of the various stakeholders. So it's all about the why for me, and then you build your approach very cognizantly of what that might do to the system around you.
think we have another question online.
Hello, hi. Yeah, it's such a complicated, delicate issue. But if you could write a top 3 list of the key tactics to try and avoid investigating employees, I wonder if could you do it, and could you share those top 3 tactics today with us?
No pressure.
So I guess when we talk in terms of the training day, we're really trying to discourage formal processes as much as possible. So in terms of, can you start with a conversation with the individual? I think sometimes as organizations, we kind of go straight for the policies. Now, there are times, and I recognize there are times where just because the evidence it needs to, but often an informal conversation can address a lot. I think the second, and we've been advising, certainly it's been the model within the health board, is that to do an initial assessment, you know, that piece of work that checks the detail of what's been flagged, gets a bit of background in terms of the individual, understands that wider context to make an informed decision, has been really powerful for us as an organisation. And then I guess the third is that if you feel that you do need to start an investigation, and the language our HR colleagues have been building into this, is build in review points. Sometimes I think there's a sense with an investigation when you press the button, you've got to go all the way through to the end. And then actually sometimes during the process, new evidence will emerge, new context will emerge that you might actually say, we don't need to continue with this, or we need to take it in a different route. So one of the terms that we've been using within the health board is know when to stop and get off the bus. And there's that sense that often organizations can be hell-bent on delivering the process because the process is key, to the detriment of the individual, to those involved and the organization as well. So build in review points and know when to get off the bus.
We have another question from the room.
Thank you. Thanks, John. My name is Robert Lloyd Griffiths. I found your presentation really, really fascinating. Much of the results that you've got in terms of financial results, man and woman hours saved, the investments that you've made in people and the differences you've made, really, really impressive. It seems a bit like common sense to do it right. Why wasn't it done earlier? And is it a point in time that you have come in and made that difference? And do you have to have senior management buy-in in order to make that difference? Because it could have been done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it could be done in any organization at any time. But it's just the wherewithal. Am I right?
I mean, we do occasionally go, is this anything special? Because it's not rocket science. Why? Again, why is this? But you could say, well, why does bad practice develop in cultures? And that there are 101 reasons why people do things that may not be very sensible or even good business over time. But to answer your kind of last question first, I don't think this is possible without senior leadership buy-in. And we've had that certainly with Bevan. We've also worked with another NHS organisation, smaller, national, but we've kind of replicated, and there are 3 months behind us, and it's delivering the same kind of outcomes in a different service model. But they have senior buy-in as well. So senior buy-in, absolutely essential. And I guess one of the things we're now looking at is how to sustain the progress. And we're looking at, obviously, our 12-month data coming up soon. So we're starting to look at month 12 to 24, think how can we keep embedding this? And to me, that's where the cultural aspect comes in. And that's also, I think, some of the clues as to how you end up in this place. I think it's slippage. It's how the age-old question about how do cultures evolve, you don't quite know, but you do end up there at one point. And at some day you wake up going, why are we doing this? and we need a change. So we're looking at that point where the organization is motivated and has put the resources in the right place to change the direction. How we got here, I'm not entirely sure, but I could hazard a guess, but I think we all end up there, don't we, in our, just how we do business.
Can I abuse my position as well and just interject, because I totally agree with you in terms of the centrality of senior leadership and senior management. What about line managers? Because they're often the people who are undertaking these cases. And I wonder if there's often an assumption that they can do it. And to what extent do we need to make sure at the point of recruitment and selection, training and development, that they actually can do that, and that when this happens that they're supported?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Just in terms of responding to that question as well, I think there's something around what drives the organisation, and often process drives the organisation. Process. Actually, we build in our policies and process to protect and kind of give a direction. Absolutely correct. But if we take our eyes off the people that we're working with, and the focus of our training has been, how do you look after your people and deliver the process? And I think it needs both. And often in large organizations, we've rested too much on, well, if we deliver the process, we're doing the right thing and everything's going to be fine. And yet we've stopped looking at the people that we're delivering the process to. So I think in terms of picking up Sarah's comments about line management, it's more than just following the process. It is about the people and that focus on it as well.
So just an additional, I can't help myself here, but just to share a model which is really useful. So when we talk about process, I think there are formal processes, but then there's the culture of doing process, isn't there? There's the over focus on perhaps bureaucracy or detail, repetition. So again, as a psychologist, it's very interesting to see how some organizations may drift closer to that as a common cultural behavior. Now, it's a really interesting model by a psychologist called Professor Paul Gilbert, who developed a whole cluster of psychological therapies, but based on a kind of compassionate approach to it's kind of third wave CVT, but it's all based on evolutionary psychology. And the idea being is that a lot of our behavior is driven by the need to regulate our emotions. Now, this isn't woolly, this is pretty good science, because we're emotional beings before we're logical beings. So you put a load of emotional beings in a system that is an emotional system, they will fall on behavior which helps modify and manage their emotions. So back to Sarah's point, you could recruit and bring in the most skilled middle managers, capable people, but you put them under enough stress and their emotional need to manage their emotions will lead them one way or the other. And it may be that's a catalyst for culture that you don't want. That's definitely an NHS phenomenon.
We're pretty well out of time, but Melanie's had her hand up for quite a while now. Melanie, if it's a really quick question and hopefully a quick answer, if you want to unmute yourself.
It is a quick question, and thank you for that. And I wonder if you could just put a link to that, Professor Gilbert, because that sounds fascinating. But thank you so much. This is so interesting, and really has got me, thinking about everything. But it's coming back to the first question that was asked by Parul, because, I am interested in justice for victims and that kind of thing. You talked about the Grace Group. So my question is, who you said we make the decision whether it goes down a formal route or not. Who is the we? And have the we had all the training? Do they recognise bias? Do they recognise all those kind of diversity and inclusion, prejudice, all of those issues that are easily missed sometimes in formal investigations? So are they aware of the potential discrimination and injustice that might be occurring? Because sometimes, I'm sorry, I'm part of a HR team myself, but HR don't always know that, okay? So sorry, that's a bit of a biggie to finish on, but even if it's one for you to think about, thank you, but very important.
So I'll start and I'll hand over to Andrew, just to put him on the spot. So I would say, I don't know the answer. You'd have expectations at the minimum standards of training and awareness. that there is a learning culture within HR systems to propagate that. And of course, learning is ongoing. Certainly from the NHS point of view, the decision to take forward a process to formalize it, in my mind, should be a collaboration between an experienced HR professional and a manager. That there's a decision-making kind of dyad that happens to lead you forward. Now, what we've seen sometimes that it gets thrown out of kilter, and a manager is perhaps more vocal or dominant, or a local clinical service need becomes more of a pressing issue. And I think that's where you lose, I think, objectivity, and perhaps get yourself into difficult water when decisions are not kind of scrutinized or at least critically developed with at least two experienced people.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. I think in terms of closing, we've turned over a stone with this. It kind of feels every time that we take this forward, there's another angle, there's another perspective on it. So we haven't got that answer fully worked out, Melanie, but actually, I'm not even sure questions like that might have been asked within the organisation 12 months ago. So what this piece of work is enabling us to do is to look at something through a new light. Adrian keeps using the question why, which is incredibly powerful in terms of how you change culture and how you move things along. And the other key part has been bringing together different teams within the organisation to look at it, because I think sometimes HR has looked after these processes on their own. Actually, those wider conversations in terms of conceptually how this is working are being explored in new ways now that perhaps weren't 12 months ago. So I've made a note of your question and we'll build it into our forward thinking. But just the fact that, you know, the conversations that we're having now within our organisation weren't happening last year, and the outcomes are looking good as a result. It just means we've got a lot more to build on, a lot more to learn from, but hopefully still continue moving in the right direction.
And on that note, I am going to draw things to a close. Thank you, everybody. On behalf of us all here this morning, on behalf of the school, thank you so much, Adrian, Andrew, Sarah, thank you for coordinating as well. Really fascinating session. I'll share the link to the recording and any other details with you. If you've got any questions for the guys here, just get in touch with me, contact me. I'm quite happy to communicate onwards if there are any further questions. Other than that, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am y cwmni chi bore yma. Thank you for joining us this morning again. Hope to see you on the online Greg session in about a month's time. Looking forward to that, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.